history has shown it's not crazy to question your government, it's crazy to not question your government.
So the conspiracy theory I'm going to be covering is the man on the moon. In 1961, John F. Kennedy was the President of the United States. The space race was in full swing as the Soviet Union had already launched a man into space. Kennedy wanted the U.S. on the moon first, and the Apollo 11 mission was created.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Their mission was to land on the moon and safely return back to Earth. On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were the astronauts on Apollo 11. 4 days later, Armstrong and Aldrin allegedly landed on the moon in the lunar module. It was called the Eagle. Collins stayed in orbit around the moon. He did experiments and took pictures. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first human to step on the moon.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Armstrong and Aldrin walked around for 3 hours. They did experiments. They picked up bits of moon dirt and rocks. They put a U.S. flag on the moon. They also left a sign on the moon. The 2 astronauts returned to orbit, joining Collins. On July 24, 1969, all 3 astronauts came back to Earth safely. There is much speculation on if the moon landing was real or not. Many believe the entire thing was staged and took place in a studio in Hollywood. For the past several decades, people have repeatedly tried to convince others of the idea that the Apollo moon program really was an elaborate $30 billion hoax filmed in a movie studio. Many believe the United States needed to cement its world leadership during the Cold War by pretending to pull off what was really a technologically impossible stunt. Moon hoax proponents think they've come up with suspicious evidence that scientists, investigative reporters, and everyone else on Earth apparently has overlooked for more than 30 years. The idea drew 15 million viewers when Fox TV twice ran a documentary on the subject in 2003.
Were the Apollo moon landings really a giant leap for mankind as claimed, or just a small step for man?
There are many small pieces of evidence that allow the entire conspiracy theory to fit together in a way that undeniably does make sense. I will touch base on several of them. One of the big things many conspiracists notice is the odd way the American flag flaps in what appears to be a breeze when it is planted on the moon by the astronauts. There is clear movement in the flag in several pictures and videos in what is supposed to be an airless lunar surface. The flag also has ripples in it. ABC News wrote an article on the ripples in the flag that debunked the theory. They wrote, "The astronauts had been wearing bulky spacesuits, so they needed a flagpole that was easy to assemble and to plant in the ground. Plus the pole had to be portable and not use up a lot of precious cargo space. So scientists rigged a telescoping pole with a telescoping horizontal crossbar that was supposed to make the flag look as if it were blowing in the wind. The flag itself was standard issue, although the top was hemmed so the astronauts would be able to slide it over the crossbar, and the entire assembly weighed less than 10 pounds. Even so, the astronauts reported having some trouble setting the flag up. They weren't able to stick the pole far enough into the ground, and they weren't able to fully extend the horizontal crossbar, and that explains the rippling effect."
You should literally be in the #1 place to see stars, not total blackness, which is what you saw. Just look at the footage again. No stars. I don't know. To me, that looks like a soundstage with like a big black curtain, but whatever.
The black background that surrounds the men was curiously devoid of stars. Since there is no atmosphere on the moon, the stars should be shining extremely bright. However, they aren't even visible in many photos. Many shadows look strange in the Apollo pictures. Some shadows don't appear to be parallel with each other, and some objects and shadows appear well lit, hinting that light was coming from multiple sources, suspiciously like studio cameras. A picture surfaced recently of Neil Armstrong's spacesuit next to his footprint on the moon. Conspiracy theorists have speculated that the boot on Armstrong's suit doesn't match the footprint on the moon. I thought that this was interesting as well, and I looked into it more, but I found research on CNN to debunk this piece of evidence as well. They wrote, "However, the footprint seen above wasn't made by Neil Armstrong, but rather by fellow astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who accompanied Armstrong to the moon. Aldrin snapped that photograph of his own footprint to allow scientists to study the tensile strength of the lunar surface, and that photograph matches the tread on Aldrin's boot as documented in a picture taken by Armstrong as Aldrin descended the ladder from the LEM to the moon's surface. People also say that the astronauts' prints are a bit too clear for being made on a bone-dry world. They believe that prints that well-defined could only have been made in wet sand. However, I looked into this as well and found that it is nonsense. Moon dust, or regolith, is like a finely ground powder. When you look at it under a microscope, it almost looks like a volcanic ash, so when you step on it, it can compress very easily into the shape of a boot, and those shapes could stay pristine for a long time thanks to the airless vacuum chamber of the moon. A picture surfaced of Armstrong on the moon. People noticed something very strange. On the moon next to Armstrong was a rock with a C carved into it. People call it the C rock and believe that whoever made the prop and set up the stage forgot to turn the rock over. It's not plausible that the rock would just happen to have a perfectly carved C into it.
But what a lot of people think is that it was actually a prop, just like you'd see on a movie set. And they lettered them and numbered all the rocks to make sure they were in the right place. So like the C rock goes over the C. Well, a set decorator must have accidentally forgot to turn the rock upside down, and that's why you can see the C. But
only some claim to see this, but another big piece of evidence is that many people claim to see wires attached to the astronauts, like there would be if it were a Hollywood set. A former aerospace technical writer, Bill Kaysing, kicked off the moon conspiracy idea in 1975 in a self-published book with a blunt title, We Never Went to the Moon. In it he writes, NASA's own actions are consistent with how anyone would attempt to pull off the moon hoax. If what actually happened in the Apollo program was scripted, the government showed a penchant for gambling and brinkmanship. For example, the government pretended to almost kill one of the crews, Apollo 13, to boost television ratings. NASA also had an astronaut pretend to break a camera, Apollo 12, after squandering billions of dollars in Hollywood special effects. Another thing that scientists and people have noticed is the fact that there is no crater or cloud of dust from when the lunar module landed on the moon. Supposedly there should have been a huge crater and dust everywhere, but there wasn't.
When the craft landed, there was literally no crater, there was no dust everywhere. It literally landed just perfectly. Well, scientists have said that if you land something on the moon, it would literally go whoosh and create a crater, and it would just create a huge space. None of that happened, which even more so looks like they just sat it on there.
Many conspiracists say that the technology we had at the time never would have been good enough to send humans to the moon.
There is absolutely no way they went to the moon with what they had. In fact, there's no way they can go today. There's no way they can go tomorrow. You don't send man where you haven't sent the monkey.
Another point made by many scientists is that with instruments such as the Hubble Space Telescope capable of peering into the distant recesses of the universe, surely scientists should be able to see the various objects still on the moon, but no such pictures of these objects still exist. A picture allegedly taken in December 1972 of the final Apollo 17 mission has been shared online and shows what YouTuber believes is the reflection of a stagehand in the helmet of one of the astronauts.
If you look really closely in the reflection of one of the astronauts' helmet, you can see a stage light hanging in front of him. Yeah, that's not a spaceship, that's not some UFO or an alien shuttle, that's a stage light. And back in the 60s, they didn't have the technology to CGI it out.
In order to get more information, I contacted a few moon landing conspiracy experts. Firstly, I contacted Mr. James Fetzer, a philosophy of science professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth, documentary maker and conspiracist. I emailed him asking what he thought the most important evidence behind the moon landings being faked was. Here's what he said. Number 1, we did not have the computing power to navigate to the moon. At the time of the moon landings, technology was not nearly as great as it is today. Number 2, we did not have technology to protect from Van Allen radiation. A Van Allen radiation belt is a zone of energetic charged particles, most of which originate from the solar winds that are captured by and held around a planet by that planet's magnetic field. The Earth has 2 belts, and sometimes others may be temporarily created. At the time of the moon landings, we did not have the technology to protect our astronauts from Van Allen radiation, which is lethal when exposed to humans. And number 3, we did not have the ability to communicate back from the moon. I also emailed and enlisted the help of Bart Seibel, a controversial filmmaker who is an avid believer that the moon landings were staged. He is most famous for confronting and being punched by Buzz Aldrin publicly back in 2002. His philosophy was this: why did we claim to land on the moon on the very first attempt, even though right here on Earth, Mount Everest and the South Pole took numerous tries before success? How did this allegedly happen with our underdeveloped 1960 technology, even though today a cell phone has 1 million times the computing power NASA had back then? He sent me a quote from Carl Sagan reading, "One of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we're bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of this bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding the truth. Then bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken." So what does this all mean? So let's say this theory is true. The government has been lying to us for almost 50 years. The news, the press, elected officials, they have all been lying to the American public about the moon landings. What does this say about our government? If the United States government was able to pull off a stunt this big, it opens the door for them to have pulled off other incredibly huge stunts, like 9/11, shootings, or other public events. It gives Americans a reason to question all of the government's actions, achievements, and decisions, because if the government lied about something so monumental and huge, Who's to say they aren't lying about everything and anything? For all we know, everything that happens, from small events to big events, could be staged by the government to correlate with their agenda and with their goals. Maybe 9/11 was staged so we could go to war with Afghanistan and Iraq. Maybe the moon landings were staged so we could win the space race and appear superior over the Soviet Union and in the Cold War. Maybe the FDA is withholding the cure for cancer in order to profit off of millions of people's sicknesses. While all these theories may not be true, they all have one thing in common. They all adhere to the government's wishes and plans. We know for a fact that the American government is very private and does withhold a lot of information from the public. With my research and my findings, I believe that the government stages events and stunts in order to further their political, economical, and social agenda.